Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library and our virtual home here on Zoom, where we are thrilled tonight to have two esteemed scholars here to be in discussion about the life of Joshua Abraham Heschel. Is that how you pronounce his name? I meant to ask you that before we had.
Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Abraham Joshua.
Yeah, I got it backwards.
Okay.
We've had a little bit of a mix up here, so I'm a little bit flustered, so forgive that. But we're just so thrilled tonight to have with us from Princeton University, Sean Wilentz and Julian Zelizer for this discussion. Sean Wilentz is studies U.S. political and social history. He received his PhD from Yale University, and he is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History here at Princeton University. And today he is being joined in conversation with Julian Zelizer, who is the author of the book that we're discussing tonight. And he is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and also a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR, among others. He is the author and editor of 22 books. He is amazing in the number of books that he produces, both by himself and with co-authors. And so, as I said, tonight we are here to discuss Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, which was recently published by Yale University Press. And so thank you for following us over here to Zoom. I'm going to make myself disappear for a little bit and let our two authors and scholars take it away.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Janie. Janie never really gets flustered. She's on top of this, you know, like white on rice. Julian, it's great to see you. I mean, I'm not seeing you, but I'm sort of seeing you. It's great to be together again. So we're going to talk about your book tonight. Now, Wilbur Mills, you've written about Wilbur Mills. You wrote a book for me in a series on Jimmy Carter. You've written about Newt Gingrich. Abraham Heschel? Why?
Good question. I think there's a couple reasons that this was interesting for me. One, I wrote a book about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society a few years ago. And one of the themes that emerged was the role of religious leaders and religious organizations in civil rights politics, and a little bit in the anti-war movement. And that was fascinating to me. It's kind of a story that hasn't been told that often, and it goes beyond the Black church. And they were pretty significant. And I thought of Heschel while I was doing that. It was someone I was familiar with. And so it always stuck in my head, what's a good avenue into that story? Part of it is personal. I come from a family of rabbis. My father was a rabbi. My grandfather was a rabbi, all part of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where Heschel worked as a professor of theology. And he is someone also, just as an observant conservative Jew, who I've read, not just about the civil rights and anti-war activism, but about his thinking. And so all of this was in my head when the press asked me to write it for the series. And finally, I would just say religious history is often, at least in the 20th century, it's either relegated primarily to the conservative coalition after the 1970s and the religious right, or it's often segmented. It's treated as a separate field. And one of the attractions through him, through someone I was really sometimes inspired by, was to put him in the context of our nation and what was happening in those critical decades. And after writing about Newt Gingrich, who's a pretty kind of aggressive, some would say toxic figure in American politics, it was a pleasure to shift a bit to someone who inspired.
Yes, I can easily understand why you'd want to have a break from all of that. You didn't want to go on to do Tom DeLay or something, right? You decided to switch dramatically. Okay,
right.
And look, but I didn't know that much about Heschel actually when I picked up your book. I knew something about it. I mean, certainly I knew about the civil rights connections.
Yeah,
I mean, his connection with Martin Luther King was very important. King called him a prophetic voice in the mid '60s. My friend John Lewis always used to talk about Rabbi Heschel a lot. And so he too is a man of a Baptist, but nevertheless moved by a conservative Jew. But there was much more than that in Heschel's life. And I want to get into all of the realms that he stood out in as a professor, as you say, a professor for many years at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. The author of some widely read as well as very important works on Jewish philosophy, theology, Jewish philosophy, and that's very important. I don't want to talk about that especially to flesh all of that out. Indeed, at a point when, in the late 40s into the 1950s, this is an aspect not just of American politics, right, but of American intellectual life that has not been, I think, properly appreciated, which is this. Jewish Theological Seminary, for those of you who don't know, is on Morningside Heights. It's right next to Columbia University. It's right next to the Union Theological Seminary. It's in the cradle of a whole lot of stuff going on here. 40s and 50s was the age of the New York intellectual, many of whom were in and around Columbia, Dan Bell, Lionel Trilling, you go down the list. But right there as well, there's this religious aspect, which is not unaffiliated, not unconnected to what's going on with Heschel. There's Reinhold Niebuhr, above all, perhaps. There's Paul Tillich, who Niebuhr brought. There's a kind of enlightenment, if you will, on Morningside Heights that's going on. But this element very rarely gets talked about, very rarely gets brought into the picture. And I think that one of the things about your book is that it actually does do that. So it's not just a story about politics, it's a story about intellectual life and where the two converge. And that's what I find so fascinating about it and learning so much from you about him. But let's start at the beginning. Okay, let's start in Warsaw. The story begins in Warsaw in 1907. Heschel is born to, I guess for want of a better term, I mean, you come from a long line of rabbis. He was born to, I don't know, Hasidic royalty or Hasidic aristocracy. You want to talk about that, just the beginnings and how he got started?
Yeah, it's really remarkable to go back to that world. This is Warsaw in the 1900s, early 1900s. And as you said, he comes from a family, it's a Hasidic family, very observant, very religious, and they're from these rabbinic dynasties. So they have a lot of clout in their community. And what I looked at in Warsaw was the two worlds he was already as a kid part of. I mean, on the one hand, he was deeply embedded in Hasidic life and learning about Jewish tradition and a very particular Jewish tradition that revolved around exuberant prayer and thinking of piety and how every person ultimately, by doing the rituals of Judaism and studying the Bible, could become, had the potential to be a pious person. And he's trained as a rabbi as a little kid. It's in some ways a classic story, and he's living in Jewish Warsaw.
He's going into the family business, in effect.
He's going into the family business. The other part, which is interesting, is it's a city that's bubbling with intellectual life during this period, including non-observant Jews, Jewish radicals, Zionists, early Zionists, Jewish labor leaders, poets, and playwrights. And he's kind of, what I try to show is he's of both worlds, even as a kid. He's introduced by his uncle to many intellectuals who are living in the city, such as a psychiatrist who attends the uncle's Sabbath dinners, and they talk about the social sciences. He walks into this institute that is filled with Yiddish writers and poets, not religious at all. They're writing about radical ideas, about sexuality, and he literally walks into this building curious and offers to write poetry for their journal. So those Warsaw years, I'm trying to show that from the very beginning, he's wrestling, even as a kid, with the tension of these two worlds that he was part of, and starting to work out very young, because he'll leave for high school. He'll go to a Vilna, to a Yiddish-oriented high school that teaches both secular and religious studies, but he's working that out already as a kid.
Is it a tension for him? I mean, can he own it? And does he move? Sounds like he moves fairly easily into these two worlds. I would imagine, it would be very, very difficult to do it. But for him, yes, there was a tension, but I think he owned it very early on, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. The answer is both, the classic historian answer, meaning he does show a kind of fluidity in being able to be of both worlds. And when he walks into this Institute of Writers, that's a pretty remarkable decision. And he ultimately decides to leave to study. He wants to go study at the university. He wants to pursue a PhD in philosophy. That's a huge step for someone who grows up like that, who again is being trained as a rabbi. So that's the ease part. But throughout his life, and we'll talk about this especially as he reaches the United States, it's also a tension. He's not totally comfortable in that secular world. He's often at odds with fellow Jews who don't have the same beliefs and commitment as him. So it's kind of both are part of who he is.
In fact, he needs one to be in the other, and he's always going back and forth, toggling back and forth. Okay, well, after Vilna, though, he ends up in Berlin, which is another step in his education. He's taught by some of the most distinguished, Jewish philosophers, teachers, et cetera, that he could get. This is the all-star team that he's getting in Berlin. And yet at the same time, and I was curious if you had more to say about this, at the same time, he falls in with a bunch of poets in Berlin. People very, maybe he would have seen their likes in Warsaw, but he's finding the same kind of people in Berlin. And he actually starts writing poetry and publishes poetry. What do you make of Heschel's early poetry? I mean, is it coming out of a particular tradition? Is there something to it that we should, notice? Because he's publishing this before he does all of his theology. This is his first stuff. Does that give any clues? Did that stuff get any clues about him?
It's kind of interesting, actually. Some of it is not what you'd expect at all. Some of his early poems, which recently were published, they were translated and published, even deal with issues like sexuality, which is not what we imagine with a Hasid. He writes one poem under a pseudonym, which is published, which is really quite moving and powerful about what's going on with the rise of the Nazis and the kind of danger that's forming in that city. And he also wrestles already, which will be a theme of his, with trying to understand God and asking questions about suffering in the world and how God was allowing that. Even some poems, if you read them, it's almost castigating God for allowing this. So those themes will literally shape his most important work during the 1950s. And it's also the style. I mean, he is known, some people don't like his style when he's a well-known author. He writes like a poet. His books are very lyrical. They're very beautiful. They're not always social scientific in their orientation, which was the mode of the day. And they read almost like a sermon or a eulogy. And they're quite beautiful and powerful. I think that's why they've lasted over time and are quoted very often. But that's why the poetry also gives a little insight into how he's going to write.
Interesting, very interesting. And he's in Berlin while it's all happening. I mean, it's all happening around him. And then 1938. So and he's actually in Frankfurt. I mean, he's not in Berlin. He's staying with some friend. I can't remember the exact details, but he's in Frankfurt. Mm-hmm. And then something happens.
Yeah, so he gets his PhD in philosophy at the University of Berlin. He's continuing, by the way, during those years with his training. He goes to this institute that's orthodox in terms of Judaism, but also is interested in connecting Orthodox Judaism to the social sciences. He's still training to be ordained yet again as a rabbi. So he's continuing to look at all these worlds. He's often frustrated, I would say. I have a quote where he walked the streets of Berlin, often wondering kind of how such a smart community can lack any spiritual core or concern for the things that trouble them. But he gets a job. He runs an adult education program where was very renowned. It was committed to teaching Judaism, Jewish tradition and theology and everything. And in 1938, the Gestapo kicks all the Jews who were there out, and he is sent to a temporary camp, which he escapes. He goes back to Warsaw just for a little short time. And I don't know how much you want to move ahead, but ultimately—
How did he escape quickly? I mean, how did he get out of that?
So he uses family connections. It's not a concentration camp. It's more a detention center, a notorious one. And he uses family connections to get him both a position back in Warsaw and to get him out of there. And then he'd ultimately leave there as well.
Right. Okay. And his family?
So his family, one brother, Jacob, had moved to London, where he becomes a rabbi, and Heschel will actually go for a short spell to London and live there and spend time with his brother. He has another sister who moved to the United States, and then the rest of the family remained in Warsaw, and his mother and three sisters would be killed during the war.
Okay.
And
So
he
here
escapes, I'll just add, he escapes. I mean, the big escape is he's invited by the Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary in Cincinnati that was training reform rabbis. The head of it is a guy named Julian Morgenstern, and he starts this program where he's essentially trying to rescue Jewish intellectuals from Eastern Europe. He has a fellowship program. And Martin Buber, who is someone who Heschel got to know in Berlin, a very renowned philosopher, recommends that Heschel should be one of the fellows. And so the story brings him to Cincinnati through this program, which is interesting in that he's going to an institution of Reform Judaism, the least observant, the most integrated. And here he is, still what we would call an Orthodox Jew, living in a very different environment.
Yes, he passed through New York, but then he goes right to Cincinnati into something that's Jewish, but not his Jewish exactly, to say the least. And he lasts 5 years, right? But then he comes back to New York.
Yeah, I'd say those are very hard 5 years. During those 5 years, that's when he's watching the news, he's following what's happening in Europe. And again, his mother and three of his sisters are all killed in different ways through the Holocaust and through the war. It's very devastating. He's pretty depressed. I say in the book how he would turn his transistor radio on Fridays before sundown, before the Sabbath, and let it run the whole Sabbath until the night, because you're not supposed to turn electricity on and off, but he wanted to know what was happening. He's also struggling with the reasons Americans and American Jews are not doing more for refugees and to get people out of there. And I talk about this incredible story where he's friendly with an Orthodox rabbi in Cincinnati. And that rabbi invites Heschel to join a group of 400 rabbis in 1943, Orthodox, very traditional rabbis who go to Washington on a train. They go to Union Station and then they march. It's called the Rabbis' March. They march through the streets. They meet with senators. They meet with representatives. They try to meet with the president, who won't meet with them. Henry Wallace meets with them instead. And it's a form of it's really one of his first touches with activism. And he is very inspired by doing it. But when he comes back to Cincinnati, he feels like no one cared, no one's listening. Yeah. So those are really hard years. And in 45, he accepts a job at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Right. I mean, yes, 2 years after A. Philip Randall was supposed to have his March on Washington, there is a March on Washington by the Jewish rabbis, and talking about different things, but not so different things. There's a kind of, consanguinity in all of that in the larger sense. All right. So yes, so he comes back to New York, back now at the seat. If there's a Vatican of conservative Jewry, a Jewry would be the JTS, it would be the Jewish Theological Seminary, the center of everything and all of that. And he stays there the rest of his life. Right? He's going to stay on Morningside Heights, and it becomes part of this community. Just how much of a part of that secular community did he actually become in all the years after? I mean, was he aware of, tied in with people like Trilling and Bell and those people, or was there still a separation?
No, he becomes pretty integrated into New York's intellectual life. I'd say he's more connected to the, I don't know what we'd call them, religious public intellectuals. So Niebuhr is one of his closest friends. They literally will walk home very often after work together, and they'll have these great philosophical discussions. And supposedly it was a sight to see because Niebuhr was very, very tall. And he leaned over a little because he had had a stroke, and Heschel's tiny. And people remember that, and Tillich. And that was, I'd say, more of his world. But by New York, yes. I mean, he loves New York City. He loves the Jewish life there. He loves, though, this intellectual cluster of institutions. And it was not accidental to have Columbia University and JTS and the seminar all in this one hotbed of ideas and thought. And there's one scene I have where one of his students comes and goes to Williamsburg because he wants to see where a lot of Heschel's relatives live. There's a bunch of cousins there, and he goes to a service, a very observant service, this student, and the student comes back and he's telling Heschel, this is unbelievable. This is so religious and inspiring. Why don't you live there? And he says, I don't have the exact quote in my head, but I can't live there anymore. I am a modern man. And I think that kind of embodied, yes, he very much connected himself, and he spent his time in universities. He loved that world.
Right. And yet, I mean, he's a modern man. Mm-hmm. He is, resolved it in that fashion. And yet he's spending a lot of his time thinking about and writing about medieval Jewish philosophy, Kabbalah, I mean, things that are distinctly pre-modern or not modern. Mm-hmm. And he's somehow bringing that to bear on all of his other thinking, coming out of the war, coming out of the Holocaust, coming out of all of that stuff. And I'm just wondering, I mean, there's a lot of books that he wrote, but the title of your book figures or beckons to one of them. And, the title of your book is the radical awareness, right?
Amazement, yes.
Amazement, I mean, I can't read my own writing.
Yeah.
Radical amazement, much better word. And that comes from a very special book, right? That Man is Not Alone. Was that a special, did you do that for a particular reason? I mean, is that a particularly important book, a particularly important idea? Why don't you expatiate, say a lot more about what a radical amazement means and what that book was all about?
Yeah, so a lot of his writing, it's taking place in the shadow, in the aftermath of World War II and the emergence of the Cold War. And he and many of these thinkers, frankly, they're wrestling with this basic question of how do we understand human society after we've had a Holocaust, we've had a brutal world war, we've created a nuclear bomb, we've used the atomic bomb on Japan. These were things he talked about, thought about, and I think a lot of his writing is wrestling with, well, what's the role of religion in this kind of horrific world, but also what's the role of religion in this new America with a consumer paradise, it felt like, everywhere, where science was making vaccines and doing amazing things. What is the role of religion? And a lot of his books are trying to wrestle with that. And I think he was always trying to understand what's the importance and value of piety and spirituality in individuals living in this world. He had a line in one piece of writing where he said, Auschwitz is the manifestation of a world without God. And there was part of him that saw the horror of the war, and then even with civil rights and race, as a modern society that lacked that core. So a lot of his books are exploring that. And Man is Not Alone. It gets to an important theme for him. It's that God, he believes God exists. This is important to Heschel. He doesn't think God is a symbol. He doesn't think God is a metaphor. He believes there is a God.
What use is God if he's a metaphor, right? I mean,
well, right. He would say that, he would argue, if you take that as the premise, all of religion kind of doesn't really make sense. Right. But he argued that God had a pathos. He got angry, God got sad, God had love. God was capable of the same emotions as humans, but God ultimately needed people to make the world better. And a lot of his writing is, how as a person can you open yourself up to the voice of God? How can you hear God? And for him, that's what religious practice and living a pious life was about. Man would discover they were not alone if they got beyond their ego and could open themselves up to the wonder, he said, of the world around him. And he talked about radical amazement, the need for humans to kind of take off the blinders that modernity had imposed on us and see things we just took for granted. And once you could see the grandeur of a tree, kind of on Riverside Drive, or once you could see the magnificence of blue water, then you start to get in the space, he argued, to really be aware of God. And that was not insignificant for him. It was not simply about being religious, not just about being holy, but it culminates in his writing about the Hebrew prophets, who in his mind, were people who did just that. They were radically amazed. They could understand and see God in the world. And what that led them to hear was the rage that God had for injustice, for inequality, for poverty and violence in this country and all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the segue. I mean, for Heschel, he's bringing to bear all of that medieval stuff. He's a real scholar. He's not just, flopping this stuff off. It's very rigorous. It's in there. But he understands prophecy in a very particular way. He understands prophecy as a call to what? To action, not necessarily to do God's work, but to do man's work, to alleviate the suffering that has happened in some way, or to right the wrongs and right the injustices, right? And that's really what leads him, I think, if I read you correctly. It prepares him. I mean, he's been an activist since at least 1943 and earlier. He's not shy about getting into the public sphere, but it does draw him towards the civil rights movement once it gets going. And it's a more familiar story to me, but I'm not sure it is to everyone else. So why don't you talk about how he first got attracted to King, how King and he hooked up, as it were, and what proceeded from that?
So he watches the news all the time, and in the late 50s and early 60s, he is following what's happening in the South very closely. In the early 60s, where we have a series of really momentous civil rights clashes, such as the University of Mississippi. These are things, like many Americans, he watched, cared about, and was very concerned, moved, and upset by. He's writing this book, The Hebrew Prophets, which was his dissertation in Berlin. He's revising it. And he's doing that in 1961, 62, until it comes out then. And he said that writing that book as this was going on helped him to see the connections between his ideas about Judaism and the prophetic tradition and what was happening on the streets of America. And the connection with King comes in 1963 in January, when King organizes a conference in Chicago on religion and race. And he invites all kinds of church leaders and theologians. And he's put into contact with Heschel, who's a pretty well-known guy by that time. His books
very
are
well
known.
known. Yeah.
He's been in like Time magazine.
Yeah.
Newsweek. So it's not a person who's like, how did he pick him? He speaks. Heschel gives the keynote, one of the keynotes at this conference. And it's worth reading. And I quote a lot of it in the book. It's a really powerful speech that ultimately says a person can't be religious and racist, that inherently, if you are racist, you're not a religious person. And this is directed in large part to a lot of preachers who are kind of sitting on the fence, the same people that frustrated King as the civil rights movement is going on. He says racism is blasphemy. Heschel says racism is Satanism. It's really tough words. And the speech, it gets King's attention. It gets a 5-minute standing ovation. It's covered in the national press. And then for the next 2 years, King and Heschel will form a friendship. They'll stay in contact. Heschel will continue to give talks. That was his major form of activism at smaller organizational conferences for religion and civil rights. And it culminates with the moment I start the whole book with, when he goes to Selma on March 21st and joins King on the front line of a march that follows what was called Bloody Sunday.
Right. Where he later said that his legs were praying as he walked along. Well, I want to get back to Selma, but yeah. I was thinking about the philosophical connections too, though. I guess suppose they had Reinhold Niebuhr in common, but how does Heschel's Kabbalistic in many ways, radical amazement to the transcendence into this other world, how does that match up with King's much more, what should we say, Niebuhrian ideas about sin and then the limits of human action, that we are all sinners, that we have to be careful about all of that. The two seem to be different in any case. I'm just wondering how they matched up.
At some level, there's a very kind of specific lineage that as a kid, he actually learned two different Hasidic traditions. One was more optimistic and it was what was the stories of someone called the Baal Shem Tov, about the ability of the pious person to uplift the entire community and the essential goodness of humankind. But then he studied this other tradition, a rabbinic tradition, the Kotzker tradition, which was all about humans ultimately they're sinners. They do bad things, and that the reason religion was so important, he learned as a kid, was to move us away from that bad instinct and to almost give us a sense of discipline. So there was that connection. I think the church really moved him. He saw in the Black church what he didn't see in suburban religion. He always castigated the rabbis he was training and colleagues, saying that the suburban synagogue was devoid of life. He said it's filled with everything except life. He said rabbis gave great sermons that sounded like op-eds. They had great, social halls, but they didn't give meaning. And he always thought, when he saw the Black church and preachers such as King and others, that fire and that intense spirituality that I think he thought was lacking, and they liked that of him. He didn't speak like Arthur Schlesinger when he was talking about civil rights, and it was important. He spoke in a prophetic tradition, which was to them very familiar, and so I think that's how the connection was forged. And then it's back to the Hebrew prophets. I think he saw that prophetic tradition with all the people who were activists and actually not being indifferent, which was the thing he hated most. He always talked about indifference as the real challenge in society. And so I think that was how some of the division with that Niebuhr tradition was overcome.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was hoping you would get to that, especially the church, almost the liturgy. I mean, there's something about, if anybody who's been to a Southern Baptist, Black Baptist church, will see the difference between that and a Unitarian church, say. Much as Heschel's talking about, the differences between, what he sees lacking, what he wants is something that's much more ecstatic in some ways, much more soulful in many ways. And you see this in the music, you see this in the dancing. I mean, that's something you don't find. That's something you find in the Black church in abundance, right? And it's something that he would have been taking out of his version, his idea of Hasidim, practice. The two kind of merge. I don't know that anybody's quite made that point as directly as it comes up in Heschel's life, but the two kind of merge. You can recognize one another. I actually knew this is something that Julian and I have another interest in another interest altogether in rock music. We both like rock music, and I'll tell you a story about this. The similarity was that Al Cooper, the great organ player, he was raised as a conservative Jew in Queens, and he said he only became Jewish when he went to the Black church. He understood what it was to be a Jew when he went to the Black church, and he understood the music that way. There's this mixture, this combination, which I think comes out beautifully. But unlike in Al's case, it comes out here in politics, and it works itself out in politics. And it worked itself out particularly, maybe you should tell this story as well, with the Selma March. That's the iconic moment that I certainly knew about. There are many photographs of the march, which, as you say, was after Bloody Sunday, going all the way from Selma to Montgomery, and in which King actually ends with a speech in which he talks about C. Van Woodward a lot, but that's a whole other topic. Talk about that.
So this is the photo for people who haven't seen it, the kind of classic photo. And so Bloody Sunday, just for those who don't remember, was the march on March 7th. And that's the one where the authorities attack the protesters. John Lewis has his head cracked, his skull cracked open by a baton. It causes Lyndon Johnson to ultimately send to Congress, deliver a speech to Congress, and then send to Congress a voting rights bill. But King really and other activists want to keep the pressure on. So on March 21st, they invite religious leaders of all faiths to come and a show of support, a show of defiance. And Heschel's one of the people who comes, and he has to come. Most of the people come on Friday, but he can't come till Saturday night because he's insistent on waiting until the Sabbath ends. his family and he are terrified. His daughter recounts being scared. It meant a great deal, and it was quite a risk. There was a Unitarian preacher killed after the Bloody Sunday March. Violence was normal towards civil rights protesters, but he goes, and Andrew Young is one of the people who will pick him up and drive him over. Young had read the prophets. Young said he carried around a copy of the prophets. He greatly admired Heschel. And by this time, Heschel was pretty well known. And so Heschel ends up on the front lines with King. I think both see the power of having them there and having someone who looks like Heschel. I mean, Heschel's looks were important. He literally grows his beard long to look like a prophet or to look like a very observant Jew. And he marches and it's frightening. I mean, the signs that surround them are frightening. The things, the mobs are yelling at them are frightening. There's no violence committed, although there's a nun in the line. And he says in a memoir that a little diary in his archives that they were throwing rocks at the nun, and he couldn't believe that people were doing that. But it was totally inspirational for him. He thought of the times in Warsaw where he was walking with Hasidic rabbis, and it was that same kind of spirituality, not in the church, but on the streets. And that's where he said that he felt like his legs were praying. And to your point, there's a scene at the end. So he finishes, he doesn't do the whole march. A lot of the dignitaries then are shuttled back to the airport, and a young Reform Jewish kid who is part of the march picks him up and drives him. And he tells Heschel that until that point, he had never felt any connection to Judaism, but being at that march and seeing him and seeing other rabbis who were there, he said was incredibly powerful because he could see that connection. And Heschel writes in his diary, this is what Judaism needs to do to really bring younger generations back into the tradition. And this affects him. He spends the rest of his life as an activist. And someone makes a derogatory comment about the protesters, that they're communists and radicals and agitators. And he writes a letter to the Times. He's just furious with this because what he saw was truly special. And it brought together all the things he's been writing about. This was the radical amazement, to see people challenging the racial order of the South.
Right. This is the radical and radical amazement. Absolutely. But as you say, he continues. He does, March 25th, which is when the march ends in Montgomery from Selma, isn't the end by any means. He continues. He dies in 72. Is that right?
Yeah.
So
December.
He's got 7 more years, and he's going to fill those up. And he doesn't follow King, but he joins King in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And he continues his writing. Why don't you say a little about his later years?
Yeah, I mean, the Vietnam stuff is really remarkable. I'll add, in addition to civil rights, he's one of the early champions of Soviet Jewry, of the issue of putting pressure on the Soviets to allow Jews to live a normal life. And he's one of he even persuades Elie Wiesel to take this issue on and to write a whole book about it. And they're very close. But Vietnam becomes the last chapter of his life. He, in 1965, which people don't remember, Vietnam's popular at that point, or it's not an issue. The anti-war movement's marginal at the time for most Americans, but he joins a group of interfaith clergy, people like John Bennett, who is the president of the Union Theological Seminary, and William Coffin, Sloan Coffin from Yale, and a group they had been involved in the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And now in March of 65, they joined together to start taking on this war very early on, 2 years before King ever makes a big public statement about the war. And they form a group, clergy and laity concerned about the war, and it's called CalCav. And he spends that till his death in this organization that has members all over the country. It grows very quickly. They get lots of media attention. Every year they have a big mobilization in Washington where they go, but they bring tons of members and followers. They march. I recount how they had a meeting with Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, a small group, and Heschel just lashes out at him. When Nixon is president, they meet with Henry Kissinger. And again, Heschel can't contain himself and says, how could a good Jew be involved in this war and be doing this? And it really defines that part of his life. And it's different than the civil rights, in that civil rights, he spoke a lot and he was associated with it. This is more organizational too. He's really involved in making an anti-war movement. And they were important, the clergy, because they gave a legitimacy to the movement that college students couldn't do. And they were very conscious about that. And one last part of this is he actually is involved with helping King come out.
That's what I was going to ask. Yes, I was going to ask you exactly that question.
King was very resistant to coming out against Vietnam. He knew the war was bad and wrong, but a lot of civil rights leaders supported the war in early '67, like many Americans. And B, they were terrified of angering Lyndon Johnson, who had been an ally to the movement. But King is becoming increasingly, he can't do this anymore. He's
becoming more radical and more amazed.
No, absolutely. And so the time he makes his first major public speech is at the Riverside Church here in New York.
Which is perfect placement, right?
Perfect placement.
I mean, it's right there in the middle of everything, right?
No, exactly. And it's at an event that this group that Heschel led put together. And if you watch, if you see the photos or watch old video, Heschel is sitting right next to King on the podium as he makes this speech. And it's there that King forever connects himself to the anti-war movement, which was really important because it really broadened the scope of the movement. It caused a lot of tension. A lot of civil rights leaders weren't happy, but King never really turns back. And it's a great speech. It's a really powerful speech where he talks about if there's ever an autopsy of America, Vietnam will be right at the center. Heschel makes a speech with the kind of language that today certainly would be considered very far to the left about US imperialism and what we were doing overseas in the country. And until his dying days, which is December 1972, this is the issue that consumes Heschel. He remains very involved. In fact, he has 2 heart attacks. In 1969, he has a heart attack. He almost dies, survives, but is always pretty sick after that. And then his final weeks, he's very sick. Everyone who saw him said he looked gaunt and he was tired. But one of the last thing he does is he goes to Danbury, Connecticut on a freezing day that December, because one of the Berrigan brothers, the 2 preachers who were involved in the movement, one's getting released. He had been in prison for burning his draft card, and Heschel, they were close friends. He wanted to be there. He wanted to hug him when he came out. And that's the same week, a few days later, he'll come home, and on the Sabbath, Friday night, he'll die in his sleep after the dinner. So that is that. And even one other thing I talk about in the book, the area there's friction for Heschel with the anti-war movement is Israel in the 1967 war. Heschel is very firm in defending and supporting Israel's right to defend itself. He even writes a book trying to explain why Israel matters to the Jewish people. And there's lots of internal fighting where some of his allies say, why are you supporting Israel gaining territory when here we are fighting against this elsewhere? But Vietnam is so much more important in many ways to him that those rifts go away and he's right back in the movement until the end of his life.
Right. Okay, well, I mean, we're going to be opening these up. I think we're going to be opening these up to questions. Is that, Janie, is that right?
Yes, that is right. Hang on, let me start my video.
Let me just, before we do that, I just want to ask Julian to end up because I want to give him the last chance. So looking at this remarkable life, an extraordinary life, a life any of us would have swapped for. How do you sum up? I mean, what are the things we should be taking away from the life of Abraham Heschel?
Well, one is the way religious thought and religious ideas have informed both progressive and religious politics, and that connection, often forgotten in our times, in the age of Reagan, as you called it, is something I think that deserves attention. It's a pretty rich tradition, and it's pretty powerful in that Heschel wasn't simply a Jewish American who supported all these causes, but he connected religion in an integral way to why all these causes were so important. And for me, that's a huge takeaway. And the other takeaway is to think seriously and have conversations about what religion, what its role is in the world in which we live. And it's often flattened, I think, especially in our red-blue America. It's hard to have any kind of discussion like this without it quickly falling into categories. But what I love about that whole group that we've discussed is they had these conversations in books that people were reading, and they could write about what's the relationship between God and man, and why be a spiritual person, or why celebrate the Sabbath, like why take a day off from commerce and work, in a way that was engaging. And I think there is a way in which religion could be engaging and interesting, and he's the kind of person who did that all the time in original ways. And then it's the life of an immigrant. Look, it's an immigrant story, and I love an immigrant story. And this is a real incredible one. This guy who grows up in a Hasidic family in Warsaw is, castigating Henry Kissinger at the end of his life, and Kissinger's listening to him. That's incredible. It's an incredible part of the country, and a really powerful story of what immigration has offered this country.
And one last thing before we turn into questions, and this is for the Princeton Public Library, in fact, is that one of the things, like all books that really affect me, what you do, Julian, in your book is you bring us to bring all of Heschel's books to our attention. And they are very worth reading, as you say. They are limpid, they are lucid, they are clear, they are powerful. They go to all of the strongest, questions, the biggest questions that we ask ourselves. So I would hope that, the library will make sure that there's plenty of Heschel on store along with Zelizer on store, because the two really go together. So why don't we open up the questions after that?
But we can't hear you, Jenny.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, that I was on mute because I have a puppy here who's being very noisy, but he's quieted down. Okay. So the first question is about for Julian, how he mentioned that his father and grandfather are rabbis, and this audience member wants to know, as an author, do you think you are faithful in following their path in a way?
I mean, I am interested in Judaism through my family history and through my own life. And I've always been kind of as Sean knows, I write about different issues. I mean, I do focus on presidents and Congress, but I'm interested in all sorts of questions over the years. And I always wanted to write something on American Jewish history, in part for that. I mean, not following what they did, but certainly connected in conversations that I've had with both of them. My grandfather's passed, but conversations I had when he was alive. And I'm a historian, I'm not a rabbi, but this was the way I could do it. And this series was perfect because the whole point of the series is to put Jewish figures in broader context. And that's why they wanted me to do it. And that's the way for me, it is not following what they do, but contributing to that conversation. And it was great to do it in part because of that reason.
Just to explain quickly, the series that Julian's talking about is Yale University Press has a series on Jewish lives, and they have these splendid books that are accessible, readable. They're not gigantic tomes, and there have been many of them, and this is the latest distinguished addition to that list.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so the next question is, let's see. So it kind of has a statement and then the question. One of the most remarkable aspects of Heschel, it seems to me, is his extraordinary prose style in English, which was his fifth language, and that he apparently mastered it almost immediately upon arrival in the US. Did you gain any insight while you were researching about his linguistic gift and how this could be?
Yeah, I mean, some of the linguistic gift is what's frustrating to many of us. It's instinctive. I mean, he is one of those people who is picking up languages as his life progressed, not only not easily, but pretty smoothly, but then can write in other languages in powerful and beautiful ways. He's tutored in English at different moments in his life. He often lives with people in Frankfurt and in London, people who know English, who start to teach him English. One of his biggest tutors is at the Hebrew Union College. When he comes here, he's very determined to learn English. And there's a guy named Herbert Drews, who's a student there, who in exchange for Heschel teaching him Hebrew, he taught him English. And he did it by giving him, Heschel didn't want to textbooks. He liked to read Melville, actually. He liked to read Lincoln's addresses. He liked to read great American texts. And I have a moment in the story where he sees Herbert Drews one morning and he's excited, he's ecstatic. And Drews is like, what happened? What did I miss? And he says, I dreamt in English. And it was a moment where it kind of literally permeated him. And he spoke with this Yiddish accent. And then once he started writing, it was very early on. His first kind of major book, The Earth is the Lord's, comes out shortly a few years after the war. And it's written like a poem that many American poets, I'm sure, would appreciate. So it was a natural instinct with some tutoring along the way.
Okay. And the next question is, what, in your opinion, is the role of religion for Heschel's modern man? And modern man is in quotations, yeah.
No, that's a great question. The role of religion is pretty essential. I think there was a part of Heschel who believed that without religion and without people having spiritual consciousness and a spiritual core, the worst would happen. He is not someone who doesn't believe in science. He is someone who loves the social sciences, loves to study psychology and read the great philosophers of the day. He is a modern man, as he said, but his understanding of what went wrong. How did we end up with a Holocaust? How did we end up with a nuclear war? How did we end up with people getting lynched in this country? In many ways, it was abandoning that spirituality, which for him derived from religion, and moving too far away from that. And I think he feared that modern man without that could become pretty cruel and could do terrible things, ultimately losing any sense of radical amazement, ultimately being indifferent to the terrible things that go on. And in the book, The Hebrew Prophets, that is the argument he's trying to make. So I think that's the connection for him. And that's why civil rights or anti-war activism was connected to spirituality, not just what he saw, but that's what it would ultimately manifest itself as.
Okay. I think that's all of our questions from the audience. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to both of you for spending some time tonight. I certainly learned a lot about somebody who I was not aware of before now. And I think that's a great thing about a series like this that can bring to light, figures of history that, are not part of maybe mainstream textbooks or mainstream teaching in schools. And I'm going to be looking up for some more in this series, and that's from Yale University Press. So go out and buy yourself a copy. And I do encourage you to read it. And we do have a copy at the library, or it's on order, I believe. Believe it or not, the supply chain issues are hitting libraries as well. We're having a harder time through our regular suppliers. If you see a lot of books right now in the library catalog, I'm going to make this as a public service announcement. A lot of things that have come out recently will show you as on order. There are things that we might have ordered months ago, and they're just not coming in. So go out and do your book buying early. If you're planning to give them for Christmas gifts, go to Labyrinth, get your Christmas gifts in hand, because books are a great gift. And but yeah, the supply chain issues is affecting everything, including books. But we will be having this book in our library if you want to look for it there, or go out and buy a copy. And then, as I said earlier, if you weren't here, come back on January 6th, when we'll have Julian joining us again with Karen Greenberg to kind of talk about the insurrection 1 year on and what that means. You can go to our Crowdcast page to find out about that. And thank you again. Thanks for a great night here. And I'm going to close down the Zoom.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay, thanks.